we have this world superpower trying to make sure that its sphere of influence is uninterrupted in the continent. So anybody who appears like is not towing the line, anybody who appears not to really support some of their ideas, they may not be the very best of friends. The world has changed. The Chinese negotiate. Their culture is a patient culture. So they have used soft power to penetrate a lot of the African continent. Of course, in Africa, China is very interested in being a big trading partner. Still going on. You cannot do certain things unless you get permission from former colonial masters or the West agrees with you. And this is where we're saying Africa needs to break these chains, these shackles of neocolonialism. What President Ruto, President Kagame, and what Ramaphosa in South Africa, what they have been trying to do, trying to say, Africa unite, get out of this. I think that is the direction to go. So we can do it.
Africa is a continent that has gone through various oppression and manipulation. The slave trade had exposed Africa for unprecedented exploitation. Again, colonization had put Africa under external rule, foreign rule. The end of colonization has allowed Africa to utilize its own resource for its own development. Nevertheless, still Africa is under external influence, outside influence. So how should African countries work with, connect with outside world powers such as United States and China in a manner that secure their own national interest? Hello and welcome viewers. This is me, Zelalem Ibeltal, producer of the Weekly Messenger. My guest for today is Dr. Edgar Githua, who is international relation expert at Strathmore University. Hello, Dr. Edgar, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, Zelalem. Thank you for having me.
One of the wealthiest nations on earth, United States of America, has enjoyed strong ties with African countries. However, this relation is viewed in different ways, in different perspectives. So to begin with, what are United States guidelines for its relation with African countries?
Thank you. Thank you, Zelalem, for that. The United States has been involved with Africa for the longest time. And some of the fundamental pillars that guide its foreign policy towards Africa, number one, there is development. The United States wants Africa to be a trade partner. So it really does a lot of trade with many African countries. And then we can also see the United States is also interested in, from a security perspective, with engaging Africa in the war on terror. So we're talking about just basically security issues, and then also issues to do with democracy and good governance. So for the longest time, you'll find the United States advising or trying to support African governments, and in some instances, just involving itself in trying to fund civic education, things to do with human rights on the African continent. So it is guided by quite a number of pillars, but majorly trade and security and democracy and governance and good governance.
All right. Dr. Edgar, though United States of America is pretending to be advocates of human rights and democracy, some African elites are accusing United States of America for capitalizing its own national interest in the name of democracy and human rights. What's your evaluation? What's your assessment in this regard?
Yes, Avila. Yeah, that is a true assessment of what they say, because sometimes the United States has been accused of being overbearing when it's dealing with African states. For example, when it gives aid conditionally, when it tries to give assistance but gives terms and conditions to African governments that you must do this, once in a while appearing to interfere with the internal affairs of African states in terms of governance. Because what the world needs to understand is that as Africa is developing, as Africa is trying to democratize, it is doing it at its own pace, taking into consideration its cultural contexts and its various people. So it's a delicate balance. So for the United States, I see it getting frustrated in that it wants Africa to develop and democratize at a faster rate than probably Africa is willing to. Because in Africa, you have to balance all these cultural contexts. You have to balance a lot of things. So some things and some of the things that the United States, for example, stands for culturally, for example, if we look at issues to do with, for example, the LGBTQ plus debate and all this, and African governments are resisting, are not comfortable in that space. So what we see is that sometimes the United States comes across as being overbearing and pushing too hard to have its agenda carried out, whereas African governments and the African continent is not ready for some of these debates or for some of these issues. So it's a delicate balance, but that is true. That assertion by elites that the US is overbearing, sometimes that is true.
Dr. Edgar, United States is also accused of interfering in the internal affairs of African countries. For example, United States is accused of supporting one political group over the other, and the purpose of which is to put its own puppet government. How far is this true?
Of course, that is debatable. We've grown up hearing and seeing U.S. influence across Africa, and sometimes, especially during the Cold War. This was especially very true during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union had this ideological war going on between them. So definitely the US would support governments that were capitalist and Western-centric, and would go against countries that were leaning towards the Soviet Union. But with the demise of the Cold War, the United States has now been left as the sole superpower and has been, gradually pushing its agenda. For example, leaders who did not toe the American line, for example, the late Muammar Gaddafi from Libya, and quite a number of leaders in Africa who have tried to stand up in Zimbabwe, the late Robert Mugabe. All these leaders were not favorites of the United States. So we have this world superpower trying to make sure that its sphere of influence is uninterrupted in the continent. So anybody who appears like is not towing the line, anybody who appears not to really support some of their ideas, they may not be the very best of friends. The world has changed. They cannot push their agenda like they used to a long time ago. But that is something that is in global politics.
Dr. Edgar, I will be glad if you substantiate your idea with examples. For instance, you can tell us United States interference in Kenya in the affairs of LGBT. It was insisting Kenya and other African governments to accept LGBT issues. So tell us this a little bit more.
Yeah, you're right. The United States has been accused of being once again overbearing in the internal affairs of African states. For example, like the debate you've talked about, the LGBTQ plus debate. Specifically, I will cite Uganda, and I will even cite Kenya. The former President Uhuru Kenyatta, was once put on the spot when he was asked about the LGBTQ plus debate, and he was candid enough to say that that is not a priority for the Kenyan society. So, and this pressure was coming from the American government.
I remember that time, by the way, former president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, said LGBT issue is non-issue for Kenyans right now.
Exactly, yeah. So he said it is not a priority for us. It's not a big issue, and he was able to avoid getting into the nitty-gritties of the situation because he felt that was not what he wanted to address. If we turn our attention to a country like Uganda, Uganda recently signed into law a bill that outlaws this. And of course, the United States were very quick, and they said it officially that they are going to reconsider, relook at their position, and rethink their partnership with Uganda. It is these kinds of examples that paint a bad picture about the American government, about the US, and the internal interference of the issues of African states. So across the continent, what we see is that the agenda that the United States has for Africa sometimes is at cross purposes and conflicts with what African governments are looking for. And this is usually the problem. And that's why people will not, on many issues, will find the US like it's being dictatorial and bullying them into trying to go in directions they do not want to go into.
Let's talk about other African partner, a huge partner of Africa, China. In fact, over the past 2 decades, 20 years, China has successfully, massively penetrated African soil. And even some said China has snatched United States political interest and investment opportunities in Africa. How far is this true? Do you think China is such a nightmare for United States interest in Africa?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. It is true. China has managed to speak the African language. Through patience and years of studying of African culture, the Chinese are using soft power, as opposed to the US, who come and use hard power and they try to force issues. The Chinese negotiate. Their culture is a patient culture. So they have used soft power to penetrate a lot of the African continent. Of course, in Africa, China is very interested in being a big trading partner and has, over the past, let's say, 10, 20 years, become probably even overtaken the US as Africa's largest trading partner. China has been involved in a lot of infrastructural development on the African continent, in their creation of the Belt, and Roads Initiative, rekindling and reviving the old Chinese Silk trade route. So China has given Africa many loans. China is doing a lot of business with African countries, doing a lot of trading with African countries. And what makes China stronger is because China does not interfere in the internal affairs of African states. So you'll find many African governments preferring to deal with China because the Chinese will talk about business. The Chinese will not come and ask you about what you're doing in your country. If you ask them for help, they could give you an opinion, but they are very conservative. They do not want to be seen to interfere with African internal issues. And this is making many people gravitate towards them. And this has led China to overtake the US in Africa. However, we cannot quite say that China is the preferred destination of many African countries. I believe we need the two. So we need these two big powers to deal with Africa. On some issues, the Americans are better at helping Africa at, and on some other issues, the Chinese are better. For example,
all right.
Africa,
all right, yeah. Dr. Edgar, sorry for interruption. I will come to that question later in my show.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
According to independent, non-partisan research network called Afrobarometer, the two most influential powers in Africa are China and United States of America, while others like Russia and other European countries have their own involvement as well. So can we see the specific interests and desires of these two influential powers, China and the United States of America, what they want really here in Africa?
Yeah. So thank you for the question. So these two powers are interested in Africa, and they will continue being interested in Africa for many reasons. Number one, trade. Both the United States of America and China see Africa as a huge trading bloc, a huge trading partner. Africa has a population of around 1.2, 1.3 billion people. So for China, this is a big market to sell its finished products. It is also a big market for the United States. And then Africa is very rich in raw materials, which China needs to grow and to develop its own economy. So China will continue trying to have, anywhere countries in Africa have minerals, rich deposit of minerals, talk about the Congo, talk about Kenya and the Tiomin, talk about basically all parts of Africa, Zambia and copper, all these places, Nigeria and the oil. So China will be in Africa because of the raw materials. The same thing with the United States. It's looking to partner with Africa for trade. And then also, from a security perspective, the United States of Africa and both China are looking at the big African bloc, voting bloc at the United Nations. Africa has over 50 nations in the United Nations, and this is a big voting bloc. So during the United Nations General Assembly, they both want Africa's support to support some of their initiatives. So look at Africa as a big voting partner that they both want to tap into. So if there are any issues, if they have any global issues that they want articulated, each of them will try to woo Africa. Each of them will try to persuade Africa to, help them support their agenda in the United Nations. So there's also that ideological battle that is still going on, that they are competing at the top level, but they need the African voting bloc to support them. And towards that, China built the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia. So, just that is one way of trying to persuade Africa, please support me at the summit, at the global, level when we have these big issues at the United Nations. Security is one big thing that the United States is interested in. China is also a big trading partner in selling weapons to African countries. And unfortunately, Africa has so many small conflicts here and there. And these are avenues to sell weapons also. Unfortunately, that is the truth must be told. So these are other avenues. The two are still also competing on the African continent on which African governments can buy military and security equipment from. So that is another area that they are competing on in the African continent. China is more interested in getting raw materials and in trade partnerships. China is interested in securing big contracts for infrastructure projects, building roads, bridges, dams, railways, all these things. That is what China wants to do because it has realized this is where the money is in Africa. Africa is a developing continent. It has a lot of infrastructural needs. So China has decided to go the trade route. America, on the other hand, is more of human rights, democracy, and governance. And that is why it is trying to put its influence more on. But largely the two of them, America has also looked at China taking the lion's share in terms of trade and infrastructure projects. And the United States has come back also looking to compete in this area as well.
The United States of America is interested in good governance in Africa. At least the United States governments are pretending to be doing this in good governance activities, while China is interested in the fight against poverty. Here some people, some African elites are saying like those democratic African governments are swaying with United States of America, while dictator African governments are doing business with China. How far is this true? How do you assess this?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is. I mean, it makes sense, and I like your assertion, and that assumption can be true because in countries where we have leaders who have clung on to power for a long time, they would prefer to do business with China because China will not ask them about good governance. China will not ask them about why aren't you holding elections. China will not ask them about what is happening in the internal affairs of that country. China will only be interested in the roads, in the bridges, in giving loans and all that. But countries that have in Africa what we could call mature democracies or countries that are progressive, they will be happy to deal with America because they will get aid in terms of civic education, human rights, and all this. And it's true, they will both gravitate. That is very true because on the African continent, we have countries that have been overrun with coups and have dictators who are in power, leaders who have clung on to power for long. And those ones will prefer to do business with China because China will not ask them about governance. China will not ask them about what is happening in the internal affairs of those countries. Yeah, so that is very true. Yeah.
Good. So United States of America, China, Russia, and other European countries are engaging here in Africa. So in your understanding, which country, which one of them could be a better partner for Africa and why?
Okay, thank you. I think from my assessment, we need all these big partners. We need relations with all these big powers. I will even go ahead and introduce BRICS, the new body, BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that axis. Africa needs to get to engage with all these global powers for different reasons because all of them have their strengths and weaknesses in various areas. Whereas China is a good trading partner for infrastructure projects and trade. China, in terms of keeping African governments accountable, may not be the best partner. In that sense, we probably need the United States because with the US, they will be able to ask the tough questions. For example, if there are countries that are not following democratic ideals, the US will be able to make a comment and say something. And we need these two countries. We need these two because if Africa is also left alone on its own, some parts are going to develop and other parts are going to be left behind. We will find we have good infrastructural projects, but our democracy ideals are not the very best. So we need both partners. Then there are other big powers like Russia. Russia's involvement in Africa has been very controversial. We know what the Wagner Group has been doing in Africa, in Sudan, in Libya, in Central Africa, all these areas. So you find, in as much as from a security perspective, they have been engaging in Africa. But again, with what we've recently come to understand with what the Wagner Group is doing in Africa, dealing in gold and doing all these things, mining, most African governments, again, need to start relooking at some of those relationships. So in a nutshell, Africa needs to be very careful how it approaches its relationships with these big powers, because ultimately all these big powers are in Africa for their own interests, primarily for their own interests, not just to help Africa. They are here for their own personal interests, and if Africans and Africa are not careful, we will find we have been taken advantage of and we've been left lagging behind, and they have taken our minerals and they have moved ahead, and we have nothing to show for that partnership. So Africa needs to relook at itself and rethink its partnerships with all these major powers. Africa needs to ask questions of how can we get in this partnership, how can we be treated as equal partners? How can we get value for what we are putting on the table? So if that is done, I think Africa will try and improve its position and relationship with these big powers.
All right. We have been witnessing the emergence of great powers, strong powers, wealthy powers in the world, like China, Russia, and BRICS countries, as you have rightly stipulated. And I think this could be a good leverage for African countries to negotiate with world powers and to secure their national interest. So my question here is, do you think African governments are smart enough to utilize this awesome opportunity?
Yes, thank you. I think we are. Africa has some of the best brains. Africa has some of the best thinkers in the world. And Africa has woken up and realized for the longest time we are lagging behind. We are being taken advantage of by these big powers. So I think what we need on the African continent is unity, a concerted effort to reunify the continent. I will give examples of, for example, debates that have started coming up. We will look at Rwanda's President Kagame. He's been talking about Africa realizing its position. Ugandan President Museveni. More recently, Kenya's President Dr. William Ruto has been trying to say that Africa needs to wake up and start demanding for its rightful share and position in world politics and in these global partnerships. So we have the brains, we have the means. What we lack as Africa is willpower. And I'll be very candid to tell you, the problem with African governments is that the Kenyan president and the Rwandan president, Ugandan president, will try and rally other African presidents to speak this language. But some other countries will either be afraid to do it, or because they owe huge loans, or because they have their own issues, they will be afraid to speak out. So eventually what ends up happening, the same big powers use divide and rule to continue conquering and taking advantage of African governments. So back to your question, Africa has the brains. We know what we need to do. What we lack is political goodwill. We lack that courage. We lack courageous leaders like Museveni, President Kagame, President Ruto, who will talk back and tell the West, tell these big countries, treat us like equal partners, treat us fairly. We need more of that happening on the continent, and then things are slowly going to start turning around.
African forefathers, our ancestors, were successful in expelling colonizers out of African soil. But still, Africa cannot be free from influence, from outside influence. And even some argue like this day there is a modern slavery, this day there is a modern colonization. Do you agree with this assertion?
I agree with you. I agree 100%, Zelam, because neocolonialism is still something that is alive and very visible in African economies. And I will go and give examples. I will tell you, for example, our founding forefathers, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, all those our late founding fathers, had a dream for a united Africa, and they really worked hard to try and unite Africa. Kwame Nkrumah actually said Africa needed to first get a political union. In the spirit of Pan-Africanism, Africa needed to unite politically so that we could speak with one voice. But over the years, what the colonial powers did, and our former colonial masters, what former colonial masters did, they crafted and instituted and put in place presidents and leaders who would not agree to unite the continent. So all of a sudden, Africa got divided, the French-speaking side versus the Anglophone-speaking side and the Lusophone-speaking side. So Africa could not unite and speak the same language. There is neo-colonialism still going on. If we turn to West Africa, for example, France for the longest time has been controlling West Africa. I know that debate has been had many times. Many people have heard about how, France used to force around 14 African countries to bank half of their currency in Paris and all that, and many other things. For example, if we come to places like Kenya, for the longest time in years past, most of our contracts used to go to the British government, like military equipment and such things. So a lot of neocolonialism still going on. You cannot do certain things unless you get permission from former colonial masters or the West agrees with you. And this is where we're saying Africa needs to break these chains, these shackles of neocolonialism. It is not going to be easy. It will come at great cost, but it needs to happen. Otherwise, Zelalem, we will find ourselves 20, 30 years down the road still talking about the same debate. So what President Ruto, President Kagame, and what Ramaphosa in South Africa, what they have been trying to do, trying to say, Africa unite, get out of this. I think that is the direction to go. So we can do it if there is political goodwill, if there is political willpower among our African leaders, it can happen.
I would like to have your idea regarding one super important, extremely important African issue, that is brain drain. Yeah. Brain drain is becoming a great challenge for African countries. So the question is why African countries can't stop, at least reduce brain drain in Africa, and what is the cost of not managing brain drain in Africa?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Brain drain has affected Africa for the longest time. Unfortunately, Zelalem, this is one of those areas that because of our weak economies, because of African weak economies, poor governance structures, African governments not taking care of their own, you find the ones who get good education, the ones who get into very good professions, for example, African engineers, doctors and nurses, because of globalization, they find a way of going for greener pastures. For the longest time, for example, let's take the Kenyan example. We have very many Kenyan nurses who have left Kenya and are in Australia, are in Europe, are in the US because of greener pastures. African professors, African engineers have also left the continent and have gone outside. How can Africa solve this problem? Number one, African governments need to appreciate the workforce that they have. African governments need to put in the wage bill, need to remunerate these top professionals what they are required. It is unfortunate that Zelalem, and I do not know, maybe I know we might have other examples to look at. For example, politicians in Africa remunerate themselves much better than they remunerate these other professionals. So you find doctors and engineers getting frustrated, and then all of a sudden they discover there are opportunities to go to Australia or to Europe or to America, and they will leave. So the only way of solving that problem is, number one, African governments putting in their budgets enough money to keep these professionals at home. Sometimes the infrastructure is so bad such that, for example, in Kenya, you will be surprised in Kenya that there are doctors who are not employed. There's the shortage of medical workers. We need these medical professionals, but you find they are not gainfully employed. So what does this young doctor do? He gets an opportunity to go to Europe. He will go. He or she will go. And when they go there, they will perform such a nice job. those economies will not let them to come back, will not allow them to come back, and they will get better remuneration, and they don't see the need to come back. So brain drain is one of those internal constructs that Africa needs to really look at, remunerating and paying our professionals the right money which will make them feel appreciated to remain back at home. Otherwise, brain drain will continue. Because of the poor economies, another issue is, for example, Africa losing its labor to the Middle East. So many African migrant workers go to look for jobs in Dubai, Saudi Arabia, because they cannot get jobs, in Africa and in our African economies. So unless we fix our economic problems, we will continue getting the issue of brain drain. It will continue occurring. The cost will be, it is very expensive. Let's take the example of just exactly what you've said. It takes an average doctor, at least in the Kenyan education system, at least 6 to 7 years to fully qualify. You can imagine the amount of resources that goes into training this one doctor. Already Kenya has a shortage of doctors. And then this doctor finds after graduation they cannot get any job anywhere. Or whatever job they get, they are being given money that is not commensurate with their experience and their expertise. They are going to go to New York. I think I read the same report you're talking about. In fact, it was saying that 7 of those doctors are actually in New York, in the United States of America. That's where they are practicing medicine, not in Nigeria. So the problem with Africa is not putting and remunerating these professionals correctly. So the long-term effect is that you will find the government is putting a lot of resources in training these professionals, like in our public universities where they get subsidized education. But when the doctors graduate, since they're not being employed in the African market, they decide to go to Europe because they have their own expertise. We even have very many Africans who have trained as doctors in the East, in Russia, especially in Russia and the Scandinavian countries and in Europe. When they come back home, they discover there are no good jobs for them. So they opt to go back to, greener pastures. So the cost is going to be very great, Zelalem.
All right.
African governments will continue pouring money and not realizing dividend for the investment that they have put into this human resource. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Edgar, we have made a very meaningful discussion, and we have successfully pinpointed the root cause of the problem, the enormous problem, the multifaceted problems here in Africa, and the solution is on us. So how African countries should work together to ensure economic independence?
Yeah, thank you. Number one, I am going to talk about we need a renewal of African Renaissance. We need a renewal of African Pan-Africanism. Africa needs, number one, Africans need to appreciate each other more. Africans need to strive towards continental unity. The African Union has the African Continental Free Trade Area. That needs to be realized. Regional integration on the African continent needs to occur faster. African governments need to trust each other more. We need, as Africans, for example, to appreciate. If I am in Kenya and I see products made in Nigeria, I need to buy made in Nigeria more than I want to buy made in the US, made in China. If we start building on African unity, we are going to start speaking as one voice, we're going to start speaking one language, and eventually we will be able to push this external influence away from the continent and put Africa in its rightful place in the world politics. So for me, African unity, African presidents, African leaders need to work towards African unity first. If we get that right, we will speak with one voice and be able to put a good fight against this global influence and global interference that we are experiencing currently. That is my view on that.
All right. Dr. Edgar Githua, international relation expert at Strathmore University in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you very much for sharing your views and perspectives regarding these African issues on Amhara Media Corporation. And moreover, I really thank you very much for showing willingness to conduct this interview in your busiest schedule. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure.
All right. Dear viewers, I hope that you enjoyed the program as much as I did. Thank you very much for watching. Do stay with the rest of our programs. Bye for now.